The autumn wind cut through Cedar Ridge like a blade, carrying dust and the promise of an early winter. Jake McCready pulled his worn coat tighter as he hitched his horse outside Henderson's general store. The paint on the weathered building was peeling, much like everything else in this frontier town that seemed to age faster than its inhabitants. Inside, the familiar smell of leather, coffee, and kerosene filled his nostrils. Jake needed supplies, salt for preserving what little beef he could spare, and maybe some flour if his credit was still good. The past 2 years since Sarah's death had been brutal. Without her steady hand, managing the books and her garden providing vegetables, the small ranch was barely surviving. "Afternoon, Mr. Henderson," Jake nodded to the storekeeper, a thin man with suspicious eyes who'd grown wealthy selling overpriced goods to desperate settlers. "McCready." Henderson's greeting was curt. "Hope you got cash today, credit's getting tight." Jake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He moved toward the back of the store, checking prices on items he could barely afford. Near the fabric bolts, he noticed a young native girl examining a bolt of blue cloth with obvious longing. She couldn't have been more than 16, with long black braids and wearing a simple buckskin dress that had seen better days. The girl's fingers traced the smooth fabric reverently. Jake recognized the look. It was the same expression Sarah used to get when she'd see something beautiful, but out of reach. The girl glanced around nervously, then carefully cut a small piece of the cloth with a sharp stone, tucking it into her pouch. "Hey, you little thief!" Henderson's voice boomed across the store. "I saw what you did." The girl froze, her dark eyes wide with fear. Jake looked up from the sack of flour he'd been examining, his stomach dropping as he realized what was happening. I take small piece," the girl said in broken English, her voice trembling. "For my grandmother. She is sick. The blue, it is her favorite color." "I don't care if it's for the president himself." Henderson stormed around the counter, his face red with anger. "Theft is theft. Tom, Sheriff Brennan," he shouted toward the door. Other customers turned to stare. Jake recognized several faces. Marcus Whitmore, the railroad investor, stood near the ammunition display with 2 of his associates. Mrs. Abernathy, the preacher's wife, clutched her handbag tighter. Young Billy Watson, barely 18 but already full of frontier bravado, stepped closer to the confrontation. "Should have known better than to let Indians in here," Whitmore muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "They're all thieves and savages." The girl's face flushed with shame and anger. "I am not thief. I have money." She fumbled in her small pouch, producing a few coins that Jake could see wouldn't cover the cost of the fabric. Sheriff Brennan burst through the door, his hand instinctively moving to his gun. "What's the trouble, Henderson?" "This Indian girl stole from me, cut a piece of my good fabric without paying." "That true girl?" Brennan's voice was stern but not unkind. I meant to pay," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "She's lying," Billy Watson spoke up, puffing out his chest. "Indians don't understand property rights. My pa says they need to learn respect for civilization." More men began filtering into the store, drawn by the commotion. Jake recognized the dangerous shift in the crowd's mood. What had started as a simple misunderstanding was turning into something uglier. "String her up," someone shouted from the back. "Teach these savages a lesson." "Now hold on," Sheriff Brennan raised his hands. "Nobody's stringing anybody up. This is a matter for the law." "Law?" Whitmore stepped forward, his expensive clothes and confident bearing commanding attention. "Sheriff, this is about more than a piece of fabric. This is about sending a message. These Indians think they can waltz into our town and take what they please." The girl backed against the fabric table, her eyes darting between the faces surrounding her. Jake could see the terror building in her expression as more voices joined the chorus of anger. "My grandmother, she is dying," the girl pleaded. "I only wanted to bring her something beautiful, something to remember the color of sky." "Lying savage," Billy Watson snarled. "They're all liars and thieves." The crowd was growing, and Jake could feel the ugly energy building like a storm. He'd seen this before, how quickly frontier justice could turn into mob violence. His hands clenched into fists as he watched the girl's desperate fear. This was a moment that would define not just her fate, but the character of every man in that store. Jake McCready watched the terror in the girl's eyes and felt something break inside his chest. The crowd's anger reminded him of the wolves that had circled his cattle during the harsh winter, predators sensing weakness, ready to strike. "That's enough." Jake's voice cut through the noise as he stepped forward, placing himself between the girl and the advancing crowd. The store fell silent, except for the creaking of floorboards. Every eye turned to the poor Irish rancher, who'd just inserted himself into a situation that could easily turn deadly. "McCready, step aside," Sheriff Brennan warned, his hand still resting on his gun. "This ain't your concern. It is now." Jake's voice was steady despite the hammering of his heart. He could feel the girl trembling behind him, her small form pressed against the fabric table. "She's just a child." Marcus Whitmore's laugh was cold and calculating. "A child? McCready, you've been living alone too long if you think that savage is just an innocent child. They're raised from birth to steal and kill." "That's not true." Jake turned to face Whitmore directly. "I've traded with the Cheyenne. They're honest people when treated with respect." "Honest?" Billy Watson spat. "Tell that to the Hendersons up north who lost their whole family to Indian raids last spring." "That wasn't the Cheyenne," Jake replied firmly. "That was rogue Comanche raiders, and you know it." The crowd's murmur grew uglier. Jake realized his defense was only making things worse. These men wanted blood, and his sympathy for the girl was painting him as a traitor to their cause. "Jake McCready," Mrs. Abernathy's voice dripped with disgust. "I'm ashamed to call you a Christian man, defending thieves and savages." "My Sarah would have done the same thing," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying more weight than any shout. "She'd have seen a frightened child and stood up for what's right." Henderson pushed through the crowd, his face purple with rage. "Your dead wife ain't here to see this savage steal from me. I want justice." "Justice?" Jake's voice hardened. "You want justice for a scrap of fabric worth maybe 10 cents? What about justice for a girl who just wanted to comfort her dying grandmother?" "She should have asked permission," Whitmore declared. "Should have followed proper procedures." "With what English?" Jake shot back. "She can barely speak our language, and you're treating her like a hardened criminal." Behind him, the girl whispered something in Cheyenne. Jake caught enough of the words to understand. She was praying. "She's calling on her heathen spirits," Billy Watson declared, "probably cursing us all." "She's praying to the same God we pray to," Jake said, his patience finally snapping, just in a different language. The crowd erupted in angry shouts. Someone threw a spit-covered tobacco plug that hit the wall near Jake's head. Sheriff Brennan drew his gun, but Jake couldn't tell if it was to restore order or to threaten him. "I'll pay for the fabric," Jake announced, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out his last silver dollar, money he'd planned to spend on winter supplies. "Here's payment with interest." Henderson stared at the coin but didn't take it. "It ain't about the money anymore, McCready. It's about principle, about teaching these Indians their place." "Their place?" Jake's voice rose. "This is their land. We're the ones who came here." "Not anymore, it ain't." Whitmore stepped closer, his expensive boots clicking on the wooden floor. "This is American territory now, and American laws apply. That includes property rights these savages don't understand." Jake felt the girl's hand touch his back, a small gesture of gratitude that somehow gave him strength. He thought of Sarah, of how she'd nursed sick neighbors regardless of their race. He thought of the Cheyenne trader who'd helped him find his lost cattle last winter, asking nothing in return. "I'm taking her out of here," Jake declared. "And anyone who wants to stop me will have to go through me first." The crowd pressed closer. Jake could smell their sweat, their anger, their fear. These weren't evil men. They were scared, confused settlers trying to make sense of a world that was changing too fast. But fear could make men do terrible things. "You're making a mistake, McCready," Whitmore warned. "The railroad's coming through here. There's going to be money and jobs for those who stand with progress. But those who side with the savages—" He let the threat hang in the air. Jake's hand moved to his gun, an old Colt that had seen better days, but still functional. He'd never drawn on another man, but he'd do it now if necessary. "Sheriff," Jake said without taking his eyes off Whitmore, "you sworn to uphold the law or the mob?" Brennan's face was grim. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and facing a political nightmare. If he sided with Jake, he'd lose the support of the town's most influential citizens. If he sided with the mob, he'd be betraying his oath to protect the innocent. "Everyone calm down," Brennan said finally. "Nobody's dying over a piece of fabric." "That's where you're wrong, Sheriff," Billy Watson snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. "Sometimes a man's got to take a stand." Jake's world narrowed to this moment. A poor rancher, a frightened girl, and a choice that would define the rest of his life. The tension in Henderson's store was thick enough to cut with a knife when the sound of approaching hoofbeats thundered outside. Everyone froze. Jake with his hand on his gun, Billy Watson half drawn, the crowd pressed forward like a pack of wolves. The door burst open with such force it slammed against the wall. A tall Cheyenne warrior stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. He wore traditional buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork, and his long hair was braided with eagle feathers. Behind him came two more warriors, their faces painted for war. "Grandfather!" the girl cried out in Cheyenne, relief flooding her voice. The lead warrior's eyes swept the room, taking in the scene, his granddaughter cowering behind a white man, the angry mob, the drawn weapons. When he spoke, his English was perfect, cultured, and cold as winter steel. "I am White Eagle, chief of the Northern Cheyenne. You will release my granddaughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake felt the girl, Aiyana, he now knew her name, step closer to him, still seeking protection despite her grandfather's arrival. Marcus Whitmore's face went pale. "Chief White Eagle? But the negotiations are scheduled for tomorrow," White Eagle finished, his gaze never leaving Jake. "I came to town early to retrieve my granddaughter, who volunteered to purchase supplies for our elders. Instead, I find her terrorized by a mob." Sheriff Brennan holstered his weapon, his political instincts finally kicking in. "Chief, there's been a misunderstanding. The girl was accused of theft." "Theft?" White Eagle's voice carried the authority of generations. "My granddaughter speaks 4 languages, has studied with missionary teachers, and carries letters of introduction from the Indian Agency. She would not steal." He reached into his buckskin shirt and pulled out an official-looking document. "This is a letter from Colonel Morrison at Fort Collins, authorizing Aiyana to conduct trade in any establishment in the territory. She is here as my representative for tomorrow's peace negotiations." The crowd began to murmur nervously. Jake could see the realization dawning on their faces. They'd nearly lynched the granddaughter of the most important Cheyenne chief in the region, just hours before crucial peace talks. "The blue cloth," Aiyana spoke up, her voice stronger now with her grandfather present. "It was for grandmother's burial dress. She passed to the spirit world 3 days ago. I wanted her to have something beautiful for her journey." White Eagle's expression softened slightly as he looked at his granddaughter. "You should have asked me to accompany you, child. I wanted to prove I could handle the responsibility," she whispered. Henderson cleared his throat nervously. "Well, if there's been a misunderstanding, perhaps we can forget this whole incident." "Forget?" White Eagle's voice could have frozen fire. "You were ready to harm a child over a piece of fabric. You call us savages, yet who here showed savage behavior?" Billy Watson, his courage evaporating, tried to back toward the door. "We didn't know who she was. We thought—" "You thought what? That because she has red skin, she has no honor, no family, no protection under the law." White Eagle's gaze swept the room like a judge pronouncing sentence. Jake stepped forward, still positioned protectively near Aiyana. "Chief, your granddaughter did nothing wrong. She was scared and made a mistake, but these men were ready to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. White Eagle studied Jake with new interest. "And you are?" "Jake McCready, sir. I run a small ranch outside town. You stood between them and my granddaughter." "Yes, sir." "Why?" Jake thought of Sarah, of the right thing to do, of the fear in a young girl's eyes. "Because it was right." White Eagle nodded slowly. "McCready. I will remember this name." Marcus Whitmore stepped forward, his businessman's instincts overriding his fear. "Chief White Eagle, I'm Marcus Whitmore, representing the railroad interests. Perhaps we can discuss this misunderstanding in a more civilized manner. After all, we're all reasonable men here." "Reasonable?" White Eagle's laugh was bitter. "You were reasonable when you prepared to lynch a child. Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, how many of your daughters have you taught to face down an angry mob?" "Chief, please," Sheriff Brennan intervened. "Let's not let this incident derail tomorrow's negotiations. There's too much at stake." "Indeed there is," White Eagle agreed. "The future of my people depends on these talks. And now I have seen how your people treat a lone Cheyenne girl in their midst. This tells me much about your character." Jake could see the negotiations crumbling before they'd even begun. The railroad deal, the peace treaty, the future of the territory, all hanging in the balance because of a piece of blue fabric and a dying grandmother's last wish. "Chief," Jake said quietly, "your granddaughter showed courage today. She stood up for what she believed was right even when she was afraid. That takes strength." Aiyana looked up at him with gratitude shining in her dark eyes. "Thank you, Jake McCready. You have a good heart." White Eagle watched this exchange with growing interest. "You speak truth, rancher. My granddaughter is brave, but bravery should not be necessary to buy fabric in a store." "No, sir, it shouldn't," Jake agreed. The chief stepped closer to Jake, his weathered face studying the younger man. "You risked much for someone you did not know. This is not the action of a weak man." "I did what anyone should do. But you were the only one who did it." White Eagle's voice carried a weight that made everyone in the store listen. In our culture, we have a saying, "The measure of a man is not in his possessions, but in his willingness to sacrifice for others." Jake felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. The angry mob was transforming into a group of embarrassed men who suddenly realized they'd made a terrible mistake, one that could cost the entire territory its chance at peace and prosperity. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with storm clouds gathering over the Rocky Mountains. Jake stood outside the Cedar Ridge Town Hall, feeling completely out of place in his only clean shirt and patched jacket. Inside, the most important meeting in the territory's history was about to begin. "You sure about this, McCready?" Sheriff Brennan asked, adjusting his gun belt nervously. "This ain't exactly your usual crowd." Jake wasn't sure about anything. The invitation had come at dawn, a young Cheyenne warrior arriving at his ranch with a message from Chief White Eagle. The rancher's presence was requested at the negotiations. No explanation, just a simple request that felt more like a command. "Guess we'll find out," Jake replied, pushing open the heavy wooden doors. The town hall had been transformed. On one side sat the white delegation, Marcus Whitmore in his expensive suit, Colonel Morrison from Fort Collins in his blue uniform, Mayor Richardson looking sweaty and nervous, and several other businessmen Jake recognized but had never spoken to. On the other side, Chief White Eagle sat with 5 other Cheyenne leaders, their dignity and composure a stark contrast to the fidgeting white men. At the far end of the room, Aiyana sat quietly beside an elderly Cheyenne woman, translating the proceedings in whispered Cheyenne. She caught Jake's eye and nodded gratefully. "Ah, Mr. McCready." Chief White Eagle stood as Jake entered. "Please, sit here." He gestured to a chair that had been placed between the two groups. Jake felt every eye in the room on him as he took the seat. Whitmore's expression was particularly hostile. "Chief White Eagle," Colonel Morrison began formally, "we appreciate your willingness to meet despite yesterday's unfortunate incident. The United States government is committed to finding a peaceful resolution to our territorial disputes." "Peaceful?" White Eagle's voice was measured but sharp. "Yesterday, your townspeople nearly murdered my granddaughter over a piece of fabric. Today, you speak of peace. Which face should I believe?" Mayor Richardson mopped his brow with a handkerchief. "Chief, that was a misunderstanding. The people involved have been spoken to. It won't happen again." "Spoken to?" White Eagle's eyes flashed. "And what of the next time? The next Cheyenne child who enters your stores? Will they also be spoken to after the fact?" The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Jake could see the negotiations were heading toward disaster before they'd really begun. "Chief," Jake found himself speaking, surprising everyone, including himself. "What happened yesterday was wrong, but it also showed something important." Both sides turned to look at him. Jake felt his mouth go dry, but he continued. "It showed that when good people stand up for what's right, others will listen. Sheriff Brennan didn't let the mob have their way. Henderson ended up refusing payment for the fabric. Even Billy Watson came by my ranch this morning to apologize. One man's conscience does not change a people's heart," White Eagle replied, but his tone was less harsh. "No, sir, it doesn't," Jake agreed, "but it can be a start." Whitmore leaned forward aggressively. "Chief, let's be practical here. The railroad is coming through whether we have your cooperation or not. We're offering to purchase land rights, to provide jobs for your people, to build schools and clinics. This is progress." "Progress?" White Eagle's laugh was bitter. "You mean the progress that has driven my people from our ancestral lands? The progress that has broken every treaty your government has ever made with us? This time will be different," Colonel Morrison interjected. "The President himself has authorized these negotiations. We're offering a formal reservation with guaranteed boundaries." "Guaranteed?" White Eagle stood, his full height commanding the room. "The same guarantee you gave the Cherokee? The same guarantee you gave the Lakota? Your guarantees are worth less than winter wind." Jake watched the exchange with growing alarm. The two sides weren't just negotiating. They were talking past each other, each trapped in their own worldview. "Chief," Jake spoke again, his voice quiet but carrying in the tense room, "what would it take for you to believe this time might be different?" White Eagle studied him for a long moment. "An honest question, Rancher. You want truth?" He gestured to the white delegation. "These men speak of law and civilization, but yesterday they would have allowed a child to be harmed. They speak of progress, but their progress always comes at our expense. And what would your people accept?" Jake asked. "Respect," White Eagle said simply. "Recognition that we are not obstacles to be removed, but people with rights, with dignity, with something to contribute. Whitmore scoffed. Contribute? What could Indians possibly contribute to modern civilization? The silence that followed was dangerous. Jake could see White Eagle's jaw tighten, his warriors shift restlessly. "Chief," Jake said quickly, "tell them about the medicine your people used to save my cattle last winter. Tell them about the irrigation techniques you've developed. Tell them about the peace your tribes have maintained for generations." White Eagle's eyes softened slightly. "You remember the medicine? My herd would have died without it. Your people asked nothing in return, because that is our way." Jake turned to the white delegation. "The chief's people have knowledge we need. They know this land better than anyone. They know how to survive here, how to work with the weather instead of against it. Maybe instead of pushing them aside, we should be learning from them." "Learning from savages?" Whitmore's voice dripped disdain. "Learning from neighbors," Jake corrected firmly. "Because that's what we're going to be, whether we like it or not." Chief White Eagle sat back down, his expression thoughtful. "You speak wisdom, Jake McCready, but wisdom is not always welcome in councils of men." "Then maybe we need different councils," Jake replied. "Maybe we need people who care more about doing right than being right." Colonel Morrison cleared his throat. "Mr. McCready, while your sentiments are admirable, these negotiations involve complex legal and political considerations." "They involve people," Jake interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "People who have to live with whatever decision gets made in this room. People like Aiyana, who should be able to walk into any store in the territory without fearing for her life." He looked around the room at faces that ranged from surprised to hostile to thoughtful. "I'm just a poor rancher," Jake continued. "I don't understand politics or railroad deals, but I understand right and wrong, and I know that yesterday, when that girl needed help, most of these good Christian men were ready to let her hang. Today, they're talking about peace and progress. Which one is the truth?" The room fell silent, except for the sound of wind rattling the windows. Jake had spoken his piece, probably destroyed any chance of the negotiations succeeding, and definitely made enemies of the most powerful men in the territory. But Chief White Eagle was nodding slowly, and that somehow made it all worthwhile. 3 days after the negotiations, Jake was mending fence posts when he heard the sound of many horses approaching his ranch. He looked up to see a sight that made his breath catch: a long line of Cheyenne warriors riding across the prairie toward his property, their horses' hooves drumming against the earth like distant thunder. At the head of the procession rode Chief White Eagle, with Aiyana beside him on a painted pony. Behind them came what Jake counted as nearly 100 warriors, all in full ceremonial dress, eagle feathers, war paint, and traditional weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun. Jake set down his hammer and walked toward them, his heart pounding. The negotiations had ended with a tentative agreement, not perfect, but a start. The railroad would build around sacred Cheyenne sites, jobs would be offered to tribal members, and a permanent trading post would be established with fair prices guaranteed. It was more than anyone had expected, but Jake wondered if his role in the talks had somehow offended the chief. The procession stopped 50 yards from his cabin. Chief White Eagle dismounted and approached alone, his weathered face unreadable. "Jake McCready," the chief said formally, "I come to you with a request." "Yes, sir. 3 days ago you spoke truth in a room full of lies. You stood between my granddaughter and harm. You showed honor when others showed only fear and hatred." White Eagle paused, his dark eyes studying Jake's face. "My people have discussed this, and we are unanimous. We wish to offer you a place of honor among us." Jake felt confused. "Chief, I appreciate that, but I'm not sure I understand." White Eagle turned and called out in Cheyenne. The 100 warriors dismounted in perfect unison, their movements synchronized like a military unit. Then, to Jake's complete amazement, they began to walk toward him. "In our culture," White Eagle explained, "we have a warrior society called the Dog Soldiers. They are our bravest fighters, our protectors, our men of honor. They have voted to accept you as one of their own." Jake's mouth went dry. "Chief, I'm not a warrior, I'm just a rancher." "You are wrong," White Eagle said quietly. "When you stepped between my granddaughter and that mob, you showed the heart of a true warrior. When you spoke truth in the council room, you showed the wisdom of a true leader. These men have ridden from camps across the territory to honor you." The warriors had formed a semicircle around Jake, their faces painted with sacred symbols. At a signal from White Eagle, they began to kneel one by one, until all 100 were on one knee with their heads bowed. Jake stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sight. These proud warriors, men who had fought cavalry units and buffalo hunters, were kneeling before a poor Irish rancher who could barely keep his cattle fed. "I don't deserve this," Jake whispered. "That is exactly why you do deserve it," White Eagle replied. "A man who seeks honor rarely finds it, but a man who acts with honor, without thought of reward, has already found it." Aiyana approached, carrying a beautifully crafted war lance decorated with eagle feathers and beadwork. Her eyes were bright with tears of gratitude. "This was my father's," she said softly. "He died defending our village from cavalry soldiers 5 years ago. My grandfather says it should belong to another defender of our people." Jake's hands trembled as he accepted the lance. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the weight perfectly balanced. But more than that, it represented acceptance, respect, and brotherhood from a people who had every reason to hate white men. "Rise, brothers," White Eagle called out in Cheyenne, and the warriors stood as one. The eldest warrior, a man with gray braids and scars across his chest, stepped forward. "I am Stone Bear," he said in heavily accented English. "I have fought the Bluecoats for 30 summers. I have killed many white men. But you," he pointed at Jake, "you are different. You have the heart of the people." One by one, the warriors approached Jake. Some spoke in English, others in Cheyenne with Aiyana translating. Each had the same message: respect for his courage, gratitude for his protection of their chief's granddaughter, and acceptance of him as a brother. "Jake McCready," Chief White Eagle said when the last warrior had spoken, "you are now a dog soldier of the Cheyenne Nation. You have the right to hunt our lands, to trade in our villages, to seek our protection if you are ever in danger. And if you are ever called upon to defend our people, we know you will answer." Jake looked at the faces surrounding him. Weathered men who had seen too much war, young warriors eager to prove themselves, elders who carried the wisdom of generations. These were the savages that men like Whitmore wanted to destroy or relocate. "I'm honored beyond words," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise I won't let you down." "You already have not let us down," White Eagle replied. "That is why we are here." As the ceremony concluded and the warriors began to remount their horses, Aiyana approached Jake one last time. "Thank you," she said simply, "for showing my grandfather that not all white men are enemies, for showing me that courage comes in many forms." "Thank you," Jake replied, "for showing me that doing the right thing sometimes leads to rewards you never expected." Chief White Eagle was the last to mount his horse. "The negotiations will not be easy," he said. "There will be setbacks, conflicts, men on both sides who prefer war to peace. But now I have seen that there are white men like you, men who choose honor over hate. This gives me hope." As the procession rode away, Jake stood holding the war lance, watching until the last warrior disappeared over the hill. The poor rancher who had barely been able to afford salt 3 days ago now held a place of honor among the Cheyenne Nation. That evening, as Jake sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, he thought about Sarah. She would have been proud, he knew. She would have understood that sometimes the greatest wealth isn't measured in gold or cattle, but in the respect of good people, and the knowledge that you stood up for what was right when it mattered most. The war lance stood against the cabin wall, its eagle feathers stirring in the evening breeze. Tomorrow Jake would return to mending fences and worrying about winter feed. But tonight, he was a dog soldier of the Cheyenne Nation, a bridge between two worlds and a man who had learned that honor, once earned, is the richest treasure of all.